On the 16th of May 2015, Jennifer Rapp stood near the edge of Taft Point in Yosemite National Park. The longtime girlfriend of base jumper Dean Potter had just filmed him and Graham Hunt wingsuiting over the edge. In the moments that followed, she had heard two sharp, distinct sounds just seconds apart. She had hoped it was the sound of their parachutes opening and not something worse. At 43 years of age, Dean Potter was no stranger to risk. A well-known figure in California's Yosemite National Park, he first gained recognition in the late 90s for his free solo climbing, slacklining, tightrope walking, and more recently, base jumping. In 2009, he set a world record for the longest known base jump when he leapt off the Eiger's North Face in Switzerland. The flight lasted 2 minutes and 50 seconds, and for his efforts, he was named National Geographic's Adventurer of the Year. Among his other achievements, he was one of the pioneers of free basing, a hybrid of free solo climbing and parachuting. He'd climb ropeless with a parachute, with the idea that if he fell, he could use the parachute to glide to safety. However, base jumping is illegal in all US national parks, including Yosemite. Penalties for doing so are typically fines and confiscation of equipment, but the risk of death looms larger than any legal threat. One of his more controversial stunts was when he started jumping with his dog Whisper, secured in a pack strapped to his back. The videos went viral, and to fans, it was daring, but to critics, it was reckless and even cruel. To Dean, it was all part of a life lived on the edge. At around 7:30 p.m. on the 16th of May 2015, Dean Potter and Graham Hunt stood at Taft Point, 3,500 feet above the floor of Yosemite Valley. The plan was a proximity wingsuit flight, slicing through a V-shaped gap in the rocky ridgeline known as Lost Brother. They had jumped here before at least 5 times by one estimate, but it was always a tight flight, and even the slightest deviation could end in tragedy. Known to his friends as Grambo, 29-year-old Graham Hunt was quieter than Potter with almost no digital footprint, but within Yosemite's tight-knit circle of climbers and jumpers, he was deeply respected. Originally from Shingle Springs, he wasn't famous, he didn't chase sponsors, but when things got tricky in the mountains, he was the man people turned to. And on this occasion, he would be right behind Dean, ready to follow him into the notch. The conditions that night weren't ideal. Light was fading, and rain clouds loomed above. Jennifer Rapp, Potter's girlfriend, was there to film the launch. She would later head to the meeting point where the men intended to land. Reaching speeds of around 100 miles per hour, the glide through the notch would require near-perfect control, and the difference between a clean pass and a fatal impact would be measured in inches. As the two men stood on the edge of Taft Point, Jennifer Rapp stood ready with her camera. Potter told her that he would fly through the notch if he had the elevation, or fly around it if he didn't, and, with that, the two men jumped. The light was dim, the drop was fast, and within seconds, she had lost sight of them as they dipped below the horizon. 22 seconds later, however, she heard a sound that filled her with dread. A loud thwack echoing through the valley. Moments later, another. Was it parachutes opening or something else? She waited for the text Dean would send after landing to let her know he was safe. As the minutes passed, the silence from her phone only got louder, but she hoped for another explanation. Had park rangers caught them? It wouldn't be the first time a jumper had vanished, only to turn up in custody. With nothing more she could do, she went to the designated meeting spot. However, there was still no sign of them. Hoping they'd been arrested, she returned to Potter's house, where she ran into Graham Hunt's girlfriend. "Are they okay? Have you talked to them?" Rapp replied that she hadn't. It was now 10 p.m, pitch black, and both women, now highly concerned, contacted authorities to report the men missing and to ask if any base jumpers had been arrested at Yosemite that night. When the answer came back no, Rapp broke down into tears. In her heart, she knew the noise back at Taft Point was not the sound of parachutes deploying. Rangers searched through the night, but it wasn't until morning, with daylight and a helicopter, that 2 bodies were found. Lying around 50 yards apart, neither parachute had been opened. However, it was the footage from the GoPro that would shed more light on what had happened. In the days following the tragedy, Yosemite's climbing and wider base jump community was stunned. Dean and Graham weren't amateurs. They had pushed the limit for years and lived to tell the tale. This time had been different. Footage from the GoPro mounted on Potter's helmet shed light on their final moments. The footage showed Hunt clipping the right-hand side of the notch. Potter swooped to the left to avoid him. Tragically though, this put him on course for the opposite side of the notch. 2 impacts, 2 deaths, and in just 22 seconds it had been all over. Autopsy showed that Potter had struck head first, while Hunt the front of his body. Toxicology showed no alcohol or illicit substances were involved. Why they missed the gap can never be known, however, there were some theories. Misjudged altitude, miscommunication, distraction, or even air turbulence. A clipped tree near the flight path suggested that Hunt may have been knocked off course right before impact, but that's speculation and can never be proven. In a sport with no injuries, where a few feet is the difference between life and death, there's no room for luck. Dean Potter and Graham Hunt knew that better than anyone. But in Yosemite, on May 16, 2015, the mountain didn't move, the notch didn't bend, and gravity didn't blink. They jumped and never came back.